The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 14th chapter. Now, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king going out to wage war against another king will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away. Let anyone with ears to hear listen." The Gospel of the Lord. Whew. Woo-hoo. I'm taking suggestions for what to preach about today. I made myself laugh the other day as I was thinking about the children's message for this, because you hear how this starts, right? Unless you hate mother or father, children, spouse. And I made myself laugh thinking, bring the children forward, and the first question I ask is, how many of you hate your mom and dad, That would have been just terrible, just an awful, awful thing. This is a hard text. I mean, you can't read this text literally and think you understand it. We know that Jesus was about love. We know Jesus was about oneness. We know that Jesus was about bringing people together, working to give our lives to care for one another. And to hear him use the word hate, it kind of bristles us. So we have to say immediately, he can't just be saying we're supposed to hate people, because you don't find that in the whole of who he was and how he lived his life and how he gave himself for the sake of others. There must be a deeper meaning here. And we hear that he's saying we're called to give up all of our possessions. What he's talking about is we're called to give up those things that the world claims to define us. Our success, our wealth, our personal pedigree. If you come into my office, I have one wall dedicated to all my degrees and accolades, right? And he's saying, Douglas, throw those in the trash, because those don't define you. That's not what makes you valuable. It's not what makes you important in this world in God's eyes. Our value comes from being children of God. We're not just members of our immediate family, we're members of God's family. We're members of a community greater than ourselves, greater than our immediate family. And he's calling for us to think with a broader mindset, to be able to see beyond just the immediacy of what's around us, our family, our neighbors, our coworkers. We're called to care about all of humanity. And that's really, really hard. It's hard to do. And it's especially hard to do in our context, in our world today. Sometimes the way you believe, sometimes the things that you think are important might cause others to come at you. Family members to come at you. Co-workers to come at you. Neighbors to come at you. The question is, do you stand firm? Do you stand up for your values and your principles that reflect God's love in the world, or do you cave and back down? And certainly Jesus is never calling for us to attack back. He's not calling for us to put people in their place. And often we do that today in our world. We do it through social media and Facebook and other things. We get into these ridiculous arguments with people that they're not going to change their minds. because you're arguing with them, and we end up doing damage. We do relational damage through those things. And so I think it's the last two verses, verses 34 and 35, where Jesus is saying, be salty. Be salty, but don't do harm. Be salty. Be firm in your faith. Be firm in your values. Be firm in what you believe, but don't do harm. Don't do harm. Don't let the world pressure you into believing what you know is wrong or that you know is destructive. Be firm in that, but don't do harm back. When Jesus was challenged, he never harmed another person. He never balled up his fist and fought with his hands. He never used his words to injure people, to create trauma in people, but he was salty, right? He kept pointing to what's good and what's right in this world, and it was always based in love. I want to share with you a personal story. When I was 23 years old, way back in 1990, right, 35 years ago, I was 23 years old. And I had graduated from college and I went to seminary. And in December, from Thanksgiving until Christmas, they called it an interim term. And what they wanted students to do is to have some kind of multicultural immersion experience. And they gave us all sorts of things to choose from. I chose to go to Detroit to study inner city ministry. And I grew up a white kid, middle-class white kid in Western Pennsylvania. I thought I was smart. I thought I had a lot of experiences. And then I went to Detroit. And during that month in Detroit, I rode with the Detroit City Police. That was an adventure. I could share some stories about that. We were learning about the civil rights movement, learning about primarily the African American culture. And for 1 week out of that month experience, I lived with an African American family in inner city Detroit. It was an older couple. They had kids and grandkids, and they took me into their home, and they treated me like a member of their family. Their kids and grandkids came over every day. We talked about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. We talked about their experience as older African American people who grew up in a segregated country, what that was like for them. They took me around their neighborhood. We went for a walk in the neighborhood, and they pointed out where the tanks were in 1967 during the Detroit race riots, right? It was an incredible experience, transformative for me. And when I left that family, they took me to their church. They had a potluck during midweek at their African American church. Oh my God. Oh my God, it was the best food I've ever eaten in my life. It was just incredible. And I remember when I left them, I cried. I really got attached to this family. They were remarkable people. And so I went home for Christmas. It was Christmas Day, and we were having Christmas dinner. And I was sitting here, my dad was right here, my mom was straight across from me, my grandmother, my grandfather, my sister, and we're having Christmas dinner. And my mom said to me, she said, Doug, tell us about your experience in Detroit. What did you learn? And I paused for a moment. And I said, I learned that black folks really aren't that much different from us. They have family. They do life together. They're human the same way we're human. They're not much different from us. I didn't think that was a big deal, what I said. But my dad put his fork down. And my grandfather put his fork down. And everything stopped at the table. And my grandfather looked at me. And he said, son, you must not think very highly of yourself. And I just stared at him. He said, how can you say that some young buck is just as good as you? If you know me, rarely am I at a loss for words. I was at a loss for words. I had nothing to say. I was struck with this reality that I grew up in a bigoted family. I grew up in a prejudiced family. And I wasn't aware of that. My dad then started to berate me and saying, you're 23 years old, what do you know? You haven't worked with them. You haven't had to deal with them. And I'm sitting there listening to this, having just had this transformative, remarkable experience, living with this gracious family that treated me as one of their own. And I just started to cry. Tears just came. I'm sitting at Christmas dinner crying. And so I couldn't control myself. I excused myself and I left the table. And I went to my bedroom and I closed the door. And I just wept. Just wept. It was like I would have rather somebody had punched me in the stomach. I would have rather, they hit me in the head versus what had just happened to me. And I sat there in my room for a while. It was probably 30 minutes or so. It was a while. And then there was a knock at my door. And I said, come in. And it was my grandfather. He didn't come in, but he opened the door, and he stood in the doorway. And he just started talking about nothing. I don't even remember what he talked about. He changed the subject and just started talking to me. And we never resolved that. We as a family never got back together to process what had just happened. But what did happen was never again in my presence did my dad or my grandfather use a racial slur. They never did, ever again. My grandfather used the word colored, but that was more acceptable than the other things he would say. But they never had the experience I had. They never had the opportunity to live in a home just for a short time, just for a week, with people different from ourselves. God had given me an experience that changed me, that caused me to think differently about myself and about the world, about humanity, about what it is that God's trying to get done in this world. And my parents, my grandparents never had that kind of experience. And they were stuck. They were stuck in the world's way of creating division and meanness and cruelty. But through my reaction of just tears, something changed. Something was different. And that experience in me caused me to want to learn more about diversity, to learn more about multicultural, to learn more about people who are different from myself. Here at Abiding Hope, we're an inclusive congregation. We welcome everyone here because everyone deserves to be welcomed. Everyone deserves to be loved. Everyone deserves to be included. But the real benefit of being an inclusive community is we're learning from each other. We want to be around people different from us because we learn about humanity through people who aren't like us. People who are different race or ethnicity. People of different religions and cultures. People who are LGBTQIA+. People who are, I'm a male. I don't know a whole lot about being a woman, right? So the best I can do is hang out with some women and find out what it's like. But the value of inclusivity, the value of diversity, is it gives us the opportunity to learn more about humanity. None of us know fully what it is to be human. I don't know what it's like to grow up in a place like Haiti and not have food and your kids can't go to school. I don't know what that's like, but I can walk alongside Haitian people and discover what being human is for them, right? And this is who I believe God is envisioning. This is how God is envisioning the world. That, yeah, we get to have our own culture within our family systems, but we better darn well recognize other family systems are going to have different cultures. Those of you who are married, do you remember bringing the traditions of your family system and the traditions of your spouse, new spouse's family traditions, and trying to bring those together? That goes smoothly, right? This is hard work. It's hard work. But what Jesus is calling for us to do today is to be salty about this, to recognize that God's trying to stitch this world together. And the only way we're going to learn is by having intentional relationships. It's one of our core values here at Abiding Hope. Intentional relationships, especially with people different from ourselves, Who are those folks in your neighborhood? Who are those folks in your workplace? Who are those people in your kids' schools that are different than we are, different than you are? How do you build an intentional relationship with those folks? Hearing their stories, hearing what life is like for them, leading with a sense of compassion that every single human being deserves the opportunity to live fully. Amen? So I know that there's a lot of political stuff going on in our world today. We have to ask ourselves, what's God trying to get done? What does God care about? And then we have to recognize within ourselves, am I more loyal to God's vision and mission, or am I more loyal to how my family system does things, how my party does things, how people around me do things? My loyalty goes to that instead of to God. Because I think what Jesus is saying today is we can't have it both ways. We're either working with God or we're working against God. And God's looking for courageous people, people of faith, people of trust, people of love, people of compassion, people of gentleness, to model for the world a different way, a way that builds life, a way that builds connection, a way that sets people free to be the child of God God created them to be, him or her or they. You know, Jesus was crucified because he didn't just hang out with people like him. He welcomed people who were of different religions. He welcomed people who were of different ethnic groups. He broke down barriers and divides that existed. He cared for the poor and those who were struggling simply to live. And the power structures rejected that. They said, that's not the world we want. We want everything to be the way we want it. And we want to control it. And we want to oppress. And we want to hold people back. And Jesus said, no, that's not of God. And they nailed him to a cross to silence him. They nailed him to a cross to make an example of him, to say, if you take a stand for the least and the lost, this is what's going to happen to you. That's why they killed him. And on the third day, when God raised Jesus from the dead, he wasn't just resuscitating this dead Palestinian. What God was doing was raising the Christ, the source of life, the source of the creation, to say love and life win. And God's never going to stop creating life and opportunity and wholeness and wellness for everyone. So, we've got to make a decision. We've got to make a choice. Is our loyalty to what God is trying to do in the world, which means we're going to make sacrifices, we're going to give up our possessions, we're only going to define ourselves as children of God, knowing that people may turn on us and attack us and come at us? Or are we just going to succumb to the world's way and then nothing changes? The world doesn't get better. Our kids and grandkids will grow up in horrible situations. I think God is counting on us to be salty people who see and hear what it is God's doing and to stand firm in that. We don't harm back. We don't fight back. We don't attack back. We just model a better way, God's way of love. God loves each of you, and I do too. Amen.